So welcome to another review as read. Today we're talking about From Third World to First by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, first Prime Minister of Singapore, and sadly passed away this year in 2015. Now this is the second book of his memoirs, the first being the Singapore story, from his birth all the way to when Singapore became totally independent as a sovereign nation after it split from Malaysia. This book's story all the way to the year 2000. He stepped down in 1990 as Prime Minister of Singapore. Now, for what I'm gonna do with this review is basically talk about the differences from the first book, because, all right, my criticisms and my great admiration for the way the book is written is all the same between the two books. What I will talk about is how this book's true anecdotes from the books itself, and also showing the pictures in the book, how this book is different. They have basically between the two books, it's what kind of advice you want to get from it, from a very visionary leader. But in a quick summary, the pros and cons of both books are actually pretty much the same thing. Is that he wrote it, and he wrote it with additions from top journalists and his wife and all, but basically all the stories and everything was personally typed by him. So the good thing is you got so much detail in that, just like how I said before, how much sugars or what did a great leader from another country have with his tea or coffee or whatever. All right, but at the same time, you can argue that he omits certain things and all that. Personally, I feel he doesn't omit as much, but that's a point of contention, and that's basically the main pro and con. For the rest of it, go look at my first review on the Singapore story. I'll put a link to that in the descriptions below. Now, the first difference in the book is, from the first book, he's always having to deal with another nation to form Singapore's safety and all of that. From this book, he's looking at it from more of like they're totally independent, they cannot depend on anybody, and how he builds a nation literally from the scratch up with no resources or anything like that. And that's the main difference in this book. Example, how he started an army from scratch, literally from scratch, and how all the difficulties he go through, and how he had to form a whole population into a unified whole with different religions and everything like that. And I think the main lesson you can take away from this book is the simple fact that one should concentrate on solutions and not the problem. This is encapsulated in the early parts of the book when he talks about things such as SIA, Singapore Airlines, which is now world famous, and how he made government projects only when the government could afford it, and then he made it very clear, even though these were government sponsored, that they must be profitable. If not, he'll close them down. His reputation was due to the fact of practicality, that they knew that if a project didn't work and it concerns Singapore's future, that he would close it down, even if it would smear his name somewhat. And the other thing you can take from the book is, of course, to look beyond the initial short-term profits. One of these that made a whole lot of difference was the cleaning up of the Singapore River. Singapore, at the time, like even his fellow ministers were telling him, leave that for another day, the environment and all that. Wait till we got a ton of money and everything like that. When we're settled, then we'll handle the environment. He said no, he's gonna, and he cleaned up the Singapore River, and from a place where there were basically it's pungent, it's horrible, it's polluted. All right, he cleared it, and within 10 years, he actually got Singapore's financial kind of consultant from Europe to come over, be able to fish in the Singapore River and catch a live fish, which was not staged, as they allege. I believe it, but people will be people and say all kinds of things. Even if it costs you some short-term difficulties or problems, if it benefits you more in the future, why not do it? Such as exercise, in my view. The other thing that he talks about very clearly for a nation to succeed, I think even on a personal level, is corruption should not be allowed to come about. And in that lesson is such a simple thing, is prevention is better than cure. It is always better to prevent a problem from happening first, than waiting till the problem comes then solving. And I think this is prevalent in both books that for his memoirs. And he did this in several ways, which he talked about, such as ministers' pay should be the same as, or similar to the CEO pay. There should be checks and balances, even for people at the top levels and all of that. And to set a precedent, basically, in the government or in your personal life, so that these little creeping evils don't get a foothold in your nation or in your person. But of course, in this book, he's writing about a nation. And compared to the last book, this book, of course, after Singapore got going and became one of the most richest developing countries in the world at the time, this book, as you can see, he deals with world leaders. This book talks a lot about the relationship of Singapore with a lot of other great leaders at the time, with the war in Vietnam and everything like that. And you get a lot of insight into so many countries have big differences and how they actually came to the prime minister of the smallest nation on earth as an intermediary, because he was a very practical man, very well known to bridge between Chinese values and European or rather American ways of industrialization. So they saw him as a good in between, which would get to both countries without bring in too much attention, because being a small nation, big news sites are not going to always just report. Like if the American president went somewhere, you can't exactly hide that. And he talks about several American presidents, like Jimmy Carter, how he talked about Jimmy Carter being very, very punctual, even with all his schedules and everything like that. About Ronald Reagan, and of course about Nixon. And I really like one anecdote about Nixon, which, to tell you how interesting the book is from a personal standpoint, because he actually gives personal interactions with these great leaders. They were shaking hands, at like a White House dinner, and all the guests were coming in, and they were shaking hands, and how Richard Nixon, at a lull between all this, turned to Lee Kuan Yew and he said, never say it's nice to meet you, because you might have met the person before. And so if you say that, he would think that you don't remember him and he could get offended. Always say something like, it's nice to meet you again. How are you? Because those are very neutral lines, So, that means it's doing things like that. And here's the thing, that's actually good advice. That's fantastic advice. And it's again, to go on a short side note, it's like how come Sun Tzu's Art of War is so fantastic a book? Because, anything in that book, Sun Tzu's Art of War at least, is common sense. But once you are told it, then you actively do it. You always amazed how in your past, how you didn't do it before. It makes so much sense. But getting back to this book, the other thing that this book talks about is the other developing countries, such as you can see with Emperor Hirohito right here. And he talks about how the differences between how Singapore developed and learned from the mistakes of places like the Philippines with Marcos or Sukarno, and in the later stages Suharto, which he actually feels is a very good leader until the later years, of Indonesia, and how all those countries had the basic issue was always nepotism and corruption, of course, being always the main issue, and how they always. And here's the thing, like I said before, with the lesson you can learn from what I said before, how if you have a plan and it doesn't work, get rid of it, get rid of your pride, and then change it to find a solution. And those countries, what happened was, even with India and everything, they just kept sticking to the same plan and kept chugging along, unable to change, and therefore the problem never got better. In fact, it always got worse. On the Vietnam War and later on the Vietnam invasion of Cambodia, you get to see how international politics really plays out, and how is it strange that how it takes a certain kind of mind, such as Lee Kuan Yew's, to really focus down on the practical, not a non-ideological situation, to put pressure in the right places and to push certain countries in the right places to form a common goal to push your own agenda. Like, he never lies in that the fact that he said that, whatever he did, it was for Singapore interests, but he knew that if you just push Singapore interests, many of these countries won't join into the same plan, such as many groups that he started, such as ASEAN and everything. But if you push their agendas too, and everybody had at least a common goal, just give and take, people come together. Such as you can see over here, here is taking a picture with Taiwan's leader, Chiang Kai-shek's son, And here he, with another Taiwanese leader, and here he is with Mao Zedong, China's premier leader at the time. And getting to that, China is also placed prominently in the book, obviously, because China at the time was the rising dragon. It's still the rising dragon, and it's now the second biggest economy in the world. In this book, also he reveals that his most admired leader was Deng Xiaoping. All right, the man turned everything around, even after he was kicked out twice of the government by the Gang of Four and all of that, and yet he came back and he basically made China what it is, and Lee Kuan Yew is no qualms saying that and pointing out that fact. And I like a little story about how it was in the book that they said how Deng Xiaoping was a man who always kept his word, or rather said things very, very carefully, like when everybody kept questioning him, and America also asked Lee Kuan Yew to get Deng Xiaoping to act on Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, and when asked constantly about what would he do, or rather China do, about the Vietnam invasion of Cambodia and whether China would intervene, Deng Xiaoping always just said, if they cross the line, or something along that lines. But basically, it meant the Mekong River. If the Vietnamese crossed it, China would have to do something, because they didn't want a Soviet-backed Vietnam forming a hegemony of, like, basically Southeast Asian countries, and of course that will form another power block against China itself. And being a man of his word, and of course for political reasons, China did get involved and invade, or rather attack, Vietnam, which caused them to not be able to take over Cambodia fully and have to pull out later on, I think after 10 years. And the last thing is, in a book of 763 pages, there is a last chapter about his family, which lasts about 9 pages. And it shows the very rare glimpse of Lee Kuan Yew with his softer side, so to speak. But yet, you can tell he was not a man who showed his emotions very much, because just like when he died, with Henry Kissinger, who came to attend his funeral, did an interview, said that he and Lee Kuan Yew were not the kind of guys who showed emotion a lot. And it shows in that last chapter, as you can see with the picture here with his family, is that he acknowledges them, he praises them, and he says he's proud of them, but it's not like that kind of like very loving kind of language, but you feel it, and it's nice to see the softer side of him in these 9 pages, giving credit to his children and everything like that, and his family, and how they helped him, especially his wife. So that is From Third World to First, an excellent book. Again, books are great, and you learn different things from it, but overall you get to learn the ideas in the head of a visionary leader, of which even the largest countries in the world, such as China, America, and so on, came to see this man, the leader of the smallest nation in the world. And as Kissinger said, a leader of a country so small should not have such an impact on the world. This is just a book to read, to teach you good lessons in life, and also to lead a moral life, so to speak, to form a guiding light, in a way, a pathway, a plan even, to get to where you want to be. So, that is From Third World to First by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you very much. Till next word.